Hi, I'm Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 97 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast. This week, we're going to be taking a look at the PiStorm, which is, well, taking the Amiga community by storm, I guess. So is this little guy the halcyon panacea that we've all been waiting years for, or is it a big goose egg? Take a look at my review and you'll find out. Let's take a look at what this little guy actually is. In a nutshell, we've got a Pi hat right down here. This happens to be on a little board, so it plugs right into my Amiga 2000. But we've got a Pi hat with a CLPD chip on it and some other glue logic. Then we have a Pi 3A Plus on here. Now, will this thing work with a Pi 4? Nope, not yet, but they're working on it. How about a Pi 3B Plus? Nope, not unless you want to desolder some of the USB connectors on there to get it to fit. Don't even bother. How about a Pi 0? Well, there's a variation of it that does work, but it doesn't make it any faster than pretty much a standard 68000. So just buy a Pi 3A Plus, 25 bucks, be happy with it. The interface and the software work was done by Captain Amygdala, which is a cool name. You'll find him on GitHub. You'll see that link right down there. There's all kinds of great information about both building the Pi and links to the Discord channel and where to get the components. Now, you've no doubt heard about getting the PiStorm and it being an 11-pound or about a $15 accelerator for the Amiga. Well, no, it's not an $11 or $15 accelerator for the Amiga. It's just misleading. Sorry, Dan. You might be able to source some of the parts, maybe, and get the parts on your doorstep for like 15 bucks or something like that, if you can find them. But you have to buy them in bulk to get them at that price. So you got to get like 10, 15 of them, and suddenly you buy 10 or 15 of these, they're not $11 or $15 anymore. They're 100, 150 bucks. And then figure you got to take an hour or two to build this thing from scratch, and let's say you work cheap and you're worth 15 bucks an hour, so we'll say $21 for labor costs for you building it yourself. Now add a 64 gigabyte SD card, get a good one, they're about $15 to $18. Get yourself a nice HDMI cable, they're about 10 bucks, and a couple bucks thrown in there for maybe some solder, some flux, and suddenly your $11 or $15 Pi costs you 91 bucks. It's not a $15 product, so just stop talking about it. And stop freaking out on Facebook when somebody posts one for a nickel above $15, because it's just annoying. If you don't like the pre-assembled price, you don't want to buy one built and tested and configured for 50 bucks, then just wait in line. It might take a couple of months. Just wait in line. Join one of the groups on Discord that's waiting to get some of the parts in, and maybe you can land one, just the Pi hat, for 15 bucks. Now that I've gotten off my high horse about the actual cost of the product, I will freely admit I got mine for free. My buddy Chris Edwards, his channel, got a link to it right down here. He sent me one for review and to test out, and I really appreciate that. So make sure you take a look at his YouTube channel now with 20% more pants. But now, on with the review. What does this little beauty do? Well, it fits into the 68000 socket. You can see the dip socket right there. Or in my case, I've got it on the little riser card from amigastore.eu. This will work in an A500, A1000, or A2000. The 1000 will require a little modding so it fits around the floppy. Chris Edwards has a good video on that. On the A2000, I could put it on the CPU socket itself, but there's really not a lot of clearance after that, and I would worry about heat buildup in there and maybe shorting it out. Now, once she's in there and fully operational, the PiStorm will intercept any calls to the CPU and instead send it to the emulator on the Raspberry Pi itself. Kind of a clever way to do it. Then an emulated O20, O30, or O40 chip, depending on how you configure it, takes over. It chews on the data, spits it back to the Amiga. Your onboard chips like Paula, Agnes, Denise, they're not touched, they're not emulated. You're using the real thing on your Amiga, with some caveats. The CPU, like I said, is emulated, and it cranks out in some tests like a 50 to 70 megahertz A30 chip. But again, your mileage may vary, and I'll explain why in a bit. It also emulates a 68881 FPU if you want to, supposedly rated above 100 megahertz. Never seen it that speed in real life. She also adds a set amount of fast RAM to your Amiga, and you can set it yourself in a configuration file I'll show you in a bit. Most people seem to set it at like 128 megabytes. That works just fine, no problem at all, but you can set it 32, 64, 128. You could probably even push it and go 256 if you wanted to. The Raspberry Pi itself has an SD slot for a micro SD card, and that's where you put HDF files or hard disk files on that little Amiga card, and that's what allows this little thing to boot. You've seen some videos on there where its speeds are rated at like 23 megabytes per second on the SD card, and yeah, that is achievable under some circumstances, and you know, it boots really fast in like seconds. But in other real world applications where it's pulling data off the drive, you'll see that drop down pretty low too. Now we'll talk about creating the files for the system in a few minutes, and I'm also planning on a full tutorial where from the ground up, from the bare board up, we're going to do a full software install, but that tutorial will come later on. Now next, and possibly the coolest thing in my mind, are the retargetable graphics that it's capable of. This is running right now at 1280 by 720 in full 32-bit, 16 million color resolution, and it actually works pretty good for the most part, with some caveats. You can set your own resolutions, and you do have to program it, the video card for resolution specifically. We'll touch on that today just a little bit, and we'll go over that in the full tutorial in another episode. The onboard networking that the Pi actually has, you can't get on the network yet from the Amiga side. They are working on that. They have that in really early beta, and they've got some testing done, but you can't get on the network yet on the internet. When I tried to use my existing card, like an A2065 card, Roadshow would literally just lock up anytime that I would try and use it with a PiStorm. I could put my Terrible Fire back in and my A2065 with the same installation. Roadshow kicks off fine, gets on the internet fine. So there's something conflicting there. They'll work that out, I'm sure. And I think some other people might have had some luck with other networking stacks with the PiStorm, but I haven't heard much about it. So you buy a PiStorm for $11. Just kidding, it's a lot more expensive than that. You plug it into your CPU slot, you turn it on, and bam, you've got this fantastic 68030 Amiga running at 60 or 70 megahertz with retargetable graphics, 128 megs of RAM, and an incredibly fast hard drive, and you're done, right? Easy peasy lemon squeezy. No, not even close. Not even remotely close. Everyone needs to understand this project is in beta, and relatively early beta. There's a lot of bugs, there's a lot of compatibility issues, and there's a lot that you have to do in the beginning to even get to a Kickstart screen on here. Just prepare yourself for a couple of hours of work just to get a Kickstart screen on here. Let's assume you buy a PiStorm hat and you buy a Raspberry Pi 3A Plus and a nice SD card and nothing else. So starting from ground zero, what will you have to do? Let's just go over it real quickly here, what you would have to go through. First, you need to get the operating system on the Raspberry Pi itself, because it's got no operating system to begin with. So what you do is you need to get the light version of Pi OS, which is just an implementation of Linux on your Raspberry Pi. You'll generally need a Mac or a PC to download the Raspberry Pi Lite files and transfer them over with a special software called Pi Imager to your SD card you're going to use in your Pi. It's not too difficult as long as you follow the instructions. Then you take out the SD card, you put it in your Raspberry Pi. Now you hook up an HDMI cable to your new Raspberry Pi, just the Pi by itself. Plug in a keyboard to it, a USB keyboard, give it 5 volts of power from a little, like a phone power supply or something like that, and boot the Raspberry Pi up by itself, not even touching the Amiga. From here, you would connect your Raspberry Pi to the your wireless network with the instructions that are mostly provided on the GitHub page. Go through Linux, set up your Wi-Fi, and then there's a number of packages that you have to download. Now these are just Linux commands like you see here, but you'll go into certain directories, you'll tell it to download certain files, and it will spend the next 15-20 minutes downloading these PiStorm files to your Raspberry Pi and then getting them ready to act like an emulator. So once you're done with that, now you're ready to go, right? Slap it in your Amiga and you're good to go? No. See, we have no ROM on here for the Amiga. We have no hard drive file for the Amiga. How do we get that stuff over? Well, now we take the updated PiStorm. Again, our little Raspberry Pi now has the emulator software on it. We hook it up to the PiStorm Pi hat. We plug that into the Amiga. Make sure you plug it in properly. You power on the Amiga. If you have an HDMI cable going from your monitor to the Raspberry Pi, you'll actually be able to watch the Linux operating system boot up on there. Nothing's going to happen. You're just going to get to a bare bones operating system for Linux. But your Raspberry Pi is completely ignoring your ROM that you have on your motherboard of your Amiga. Now you do need some ROM in there. I had to put a Kickstart 1.3 ROM in. When I tried to do it without any ROM in there at all, it just doesn't even do anything, it doesn't boot. I also tried it with a ROMulator, doesn't work. So now we have an Amiga, we have Raspberry Pi running on a screen that we can't interact with because it doesn't have any idea about the Amiga keyboard or mouse. Where we go next is to our PC, as you can see right here. Now from here, you have to download a program for Windows. If you're assuming you're using Windows, called Putty. Okay, Putty is a program that allows you to SSH remote into your Raspberry Pi. Now you need to know what your Raspberry Pi's IP address is. You can either, when you first set up the wireless, do an IP config. It'll tell you your local IP address. Or you can use a utility like Advanced IP Scanner, or look in the page of your router and see what IP address your Pi has been given. You plug in that information to Putty, and then you're presented with a very similar Raspberry Pi screen like we're looking at on the Amiga here. Log in with username Pi, password of Raspberry, unless you've already changed that, and do a directory, and you're going to see a directory called Amiga files. That's where we're going to dump the ROMs and dump the hard drive files to. And you're going to see another directory called PiStorm, where our configuration file is. Let's take a look at the configuration file real quick on Putty. So we're going to, from within this Putty interface that you see here, we're going to change the directory to the PiStorm directory. We're going to type in sudo, S-U-D-O, space nano, N-A-N-O, which is the text editor, and then default.cfg. All right, and all these instructions are right on the GitHub too. That's going to open up a text file that tells the Raspberry Pi what to do. Up at the top, you can see you can choose which processor it's going to emulate, 68020 all the way up to 68040. Keep in mind that changing the processor does not change the speed. It only changes the kinds of instructions that the Raspberry Pi is going to translate. A lot of people find things run fastest if you choose the 68020, since it has fewer instructions, and it's also not emulating a 6881 apparently when you're in 020 mode, as I found out. So things do sometimes run faster just choosing an 020. Now when we scroll down a little bit, you can see you can tell it the location of what ROM to use. Here you can see mine is looking at the ROM in my Amiga files directory. And then next, you can tell it what hard drive files to use. I think you can use up to like 10 hard drive files. Don't do that. Just make it simple on yourself. If you're using Amiga OS 3.1.4 or 3.2, you can make these as just about as big as you want to. But remember, we're going to have to be transferring these back and forth between the Raspberry Pi and your PC. So if you make yourself a 50 or 60 gigabyte file, expect to wait a little while you transfer it over. I keep them small. 10 gigabytes max, someplace in that area. Now you can also adjust the RAM size in here. There's an area where you can just tell it how much RAM to use in the system, and a couple other little configurations that are not yet available and in use. So now how do we get our HDF files and our ROM files over to the Raspberry Pi, well, we need a different program for that. So we exit out of Putty. We'll download something like Filezilla is a good one. Get the Filezilla client. You're going to log into it like I'm doing here using the IP address and the password, the username and password we've already talked about. And you're going to use port 22, which is for secure FTP. Now, if everything goes right, on one side of the screen, you're going to see the Raspberry Pi. The other side of the screen, you're going to see your PC. Now, the ROMs are not a huge issue to get. If you've already got something like you've purchased Amiga OS 3.14 or 3.2, you've got the ROMs in digital form already. If you've got Amiga Forever, you've got up to Amiga OS 3.1 ROMs that you're able to use completely freely. The trick is, it wants to use an Amiga 1200 ROM image, which is kind of funny considering this is on an ECS machine only. But apparently, in doing some research, it's because the Amiga 1200 ROM has a better chance of properly recognizing the virtual hard drive. So grab yourself an Amiga 1200 ROM, and we're going to FTP it, boom, drag it right over to the Amiga files directory. Keep an eye on the name, because that's the exact name, including the exact case, that you have to use in the default .cfg file. Remember, Linux is 100% case sensitive. So if you got an uppercase K and you type in a lowercase k in the default .config, it ain't gonna see it. So if something doesn't work, check your case. Now we need an HDF file or hard drive file to boot, right? One would assume, as I did, that you could take an existing hard drive file, like I had on my Amiga 2000 here, where I did the Amiga 2000 build a couple of weeks ago. Pretty generic install of Amiga OS 3.14 on a compact flash card. I converted that little puppy over to an HDF file. I transferred that over to my PiStorm thinking, this is going to work great. There's nothing fancy about this. It's going to work fine. No. Didn't work fine. Didn't work fine at all. I could launch Workbench. Workbench seemed fine. Retargetable Graphics, they seemed fine. But as soon as I started to do anything, it would start acting squirrely. Launch a game using WHD load. Graphics were flickering all over the place. Sprites were jumping. Nothing was right. It just wasn't right. And the thing would crash left and right. I'd go to open something on a retargetable graphics screen. Maybe 30% of the programs I tried would work. The rest of them, lock up the Pi. I thought I had a bad PiStorm. I spent a couple of hours talking with the devs on Discord. And finally, I figured out there's just something funky about creating an installation on a Windows PC and moving it over to the Pi. It just doesn't work right. I cleared out that entire installation, reformatted the drive, reinstalled Amiga OS right on the Raspberry Pi itself, and then everything started working much, much better. So we still do need to use something like WinUAE or Amiga Forever to create the HDF files. We just don't want to format them or put anything on it at this point in time. You don't want to create the computer in WinUAE and load the operating system, load your programs, then move it over, because it doesn't seem to work right now. They'll probably fix that. So, as you can see here, we're going to launch WinUAE, and we go to the screen, the CD hard drive screen, select Add Hard File, like you see here, click Full Drive /RDB mode, give the drive a size, like 4 gigabytes, 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes, whatever you want to use. Click Create, give it a name, and it'll ask for a location to do the file, and then it will create a completely blank HDF file that we can transfer over to the Raspberry Pi. While you're here, make a small one too, like a 500 megabyte file, because you're going to be transferring things back and forth between the Raspberry Pi and your PC to get programs loaded, things that you don't have on floppy, big files. And you're going to have to transfer these HDF files back and forth. And believe me, it's a lot easier to transfer a 500 megabyte HDF file than it is to wait on a 16 gigabyte HDF file to transfer over Wi-Fi. Did I mention this thing was in beta? Did I mention it's not a walk in the park to set this thing up? Yeah, it's not. There's a lot you have to do to get this thing configured. You literally need 3 different computers to get this functional, to even get to a Kickstart boot screen. You need your Amiga, you need the Raspberry Pi itself, which is a full-fledged computer, and you need your PC or Mac or Linux machine or whatnot to get the thing set up. 3 different computers just to get to a Kickstart screen. I don't recall having to do this with any other accelerator I own for the Amiga. Now that we have our ROM, and we've already transferred that over with Filezilla, now we can transfer these 2 HDF files over, also with Filezilla. Just move them right on over to the Amiga files directory. Again, remember to keep them that they're case sensitive. Once that's done and they're transferred, go back into Putty, edit the default.cfg file in your PiStorm directory, give it the exact path to that Amiga files, then the ROM file, the exact path to your 1 or 2 HDF files, just like I show right here. You still with me? You still want to buy a PiStorm? Good. Now, power down your Amiga, which brings me to an interesting point. Since before I was born, I was taught don't shut a computer down without shutting the operating system down properly first, or you're going to bugger things up. And that is twice as important for Linux, is what I've always been taught. So, how do you shut down your PiStorm before you shut down your Amiga? You don't. You can't. Unless you want to go to your PC, use Putty, log into it, stop the emulator, and give it a shutdown command remotely. You can't do it. Now the guys in the GitHub and the Discord, they say, oh, no problem at all. We've shut them off hundreds of times. Everything's fine. But sooner or later, it's going to corrupt something in Linux. It's going to do something wrong. It's going to screw up your HDF files. It's going to screw up your Raspberry Pi. It's just going to. Now, there is a beta of an Amiga interface that can talk directly with the Raspberry Pi that will allow you to do things like shut the Pi down remotely. And I think once that's improved, maybe with a nice GUI interface, that's going to be better. But in the meantime, they say just normally power it down and just power down the Pi. Okay. Now, assuming you followed the instructions on the GitHub page and you've told it to launch the emulator as soon as the Raspberry Pi boots, which I will be covering in my tutorial video, when you turn your Amiga back on, you should, in theory, be presented with a Kickstart screen, just our normal Kickstart screen. We'd assume it's 3.14 or 3.2. Now it takes a good 30 seconds, 40 seconds for the Raspberry Pi to boot, and your Amiga ain't going to do nothing until that Raspberry Pi is completed booting. Then it will boot the Amiga. Load Amiga OS from floppy, if that's what you want to do, or like in my case, I got a GoTech in here. I had the Amiga 314 files on the GoTech. I was able to go to my install disk, recognized it just fine, did a normal install. So I put 314 on here. I put Best Workbench on here like I like to do, and I copied over a couple of things like image effects and Personal Paint and sysinfo and AIBB, things that I want to use to test the Pi out. Now let's take a look at a couple of things. You see we have a pretty normal Workbench screen here. I've got 1 mega chip RAM. I've got 130 megabytes of fast RAM, which is kind of nice. Let's take a look at a couple of things like sysinfo. We're going to go over to our sysinfo folder, launch our little friend. Yay! All right, it says it's a 68030 with a 6881. The MMU is not real. It doesn't really do anything. Let's check our speed here. I'm going to give it the old speed test. Not bad, really. 12,000 dry stones, 12.59 MIPS, 5.94 megaflops. This is faster than an Amiga 3000, but not quite as fast as an Amiga 4000. That's reasonable. When we look at our memory list, we see 128 megabytes of 32-bit fast RAM and 1 megabyte of chip RAM, which is on my Amiga 2000. Of course, this is what a lot of people have talked about, is the drive speed. When you do a speed test here, 21 megabytes per second. When you do it again, it completely lies to you. This is not a 786 megabyte drive here. It just isn't. It's reading from a cache. Now, you can do real-world tests of the drive speed. Like in this case, I've got some nice big files here. Let's take a look at all those. So here is a 3.5 megabyte JPEG file. Let's just take it from the onboard HDF file, and we're going to drag it and pop it onto the RAM disk, and it should just take literally, a fraction of a second, and the thing is just over there. I mean, so yeah, the drive is really, really fast. It was able to transfer it really quickly. Here's another fairly popular speed testing program, AIBB. That's fine. We're going to tell it to use 68020 code, and we're going to tell it to use the math coprocessor where it's available. So we do a couple of tests here. And in testing, it tests pretty darn nice, pretty similar. Let's generate a nice beach ball. Yeah, pretty zippy. So this goes back a little bit to how did I get these files over here? Well, of course, your existing floppy drive, your existing GoTech works just fine. But if you want to get a big file over there, something more than a couple of megs like those pictures, just take that 500 megabyte HDF file, format it as a drive. On mine, I called it XFIR, and then log in from your PC over to the PiStorm, copy that to your PC, attach that to one of your emulations in Amiga Forever or WinUAE, copy all the Amiga programs over you want to, copy your WHD load games over, those things get huge, those folders get huge, copy them onto there, then, again, using Filezilla, move that whole HDF file back to the PiStorm, reboot the Amiga, and wow, there's all your files. It's not that hard, but it is a convenient way, relatively convenient way to do it, since networking isn't quite working yet. So now I have a nice installation. I've got this thing working like an O30 at 50, 60 megahertz, faster than an Amiga 3000, right? This thing must be blazing fast. Got a nice amount of RAM. I've got a really fast hard drive in here. So playing games on this has got to be like a dream come true, right? They just have to absolutely fly. Well, no. Let's take a look at some real world examples. wow. If they worked at all, or if they didn't have a bunch of corruption, those things play worse than an Amiga 500 with 1 megabyte of RAM, no acceleration. You know, they literally 30-40% slower than something like that. So what gives here? This is supposed to be an accelerator. I mean, I spent a whole $15 expecting a perfect accelerator. What gives? Well, to be honest, many games, including more modern ones that are created now and some of the later generation Amiga games, they work fine. They're relatively fast, they work just fine, and you'll be perfectly happy with them. But a lot of games are designed from the ground up only to recognize the Amiga's chip RAM. That's all they care about, is how much chip RAM it has. They don't care about your fast RAM. And what happens is the PiStorm accesses chip RAM about 33% slower than a bog standard Amiga 500. Literally accesses chip RAM slower, and chip RAM access is slow as it is. It has something to do with having to pull the data in, have the CPU process it, and swap it back out to chip RAM, that it just doesn't do it very fast. So, on these games that expect chip RAM to be in use, they just run really, really, really poorly, to the point they're not even fun. It's not, you know, playing Saint Dragon, it's one of my favorite games. I play that on my Amiga 1000. You know, I pop in my classic 68020 accelerator. I play that on there. Thing is flawless. Every note, every graphic, every movement, like butter. Play it on here? Okay, that sucked. Now, how about the games that can see fast RAM, like the newer ones, like Envia, which we'll look at in a second, or maybe River Raid Reloaded, or something like Worthy, things that are coded in the modern world, and they can see the fast RAM. They are going to run well, and they're going to run better than on a 68,000. And the reason is just brute force. By just pure brute force, it sees the fast RAM, it sees the faster CPU, and it helps make up for the fact that the chip RAM access sucks. Now, to be honest, even the games that I've tried that actually run halfway decent, there's something that's not quite right about the audio. It's like it's not quite there. It's like just a little slow, or maybe a sound effect is a little slow. And there is a definite 100% lag on interacting with fast games. You try and use the joystick and move your guy. It's like some of the whining people do about emulation, where it's just not perfect like it generally needs to be on the Amiga. Let's take a quick peek at some of the modern games, like Envia here, and even that, take a look. It feels just a little bit off. On Envia, without a doubt, I'm able to get to the first boss without even a second thought. It's just no problem at all. I can get to the first boss, maybe lose a life or two, but on here, 15-20 seconds, because of the way the controls are working, you just die. So, all honesty, I tried a dozen or more games on here, all kinds of different genres, all kinds of ages, and some were really slow, like the ones I showed you, and were just unplayable, not even fun. Some ran pretty well, but they're just a little unresponsive, you know? Like, take for example, Frontier Elite, the beautiful intro that we all love to watch when we do an accelerator. Yeah, that works fine. And it looks beautiful, nice and fast. But when you're controlling your ship and she just, you know, responds like you're driving through molasses with a controller, suddenly it becomes not fun, no matter how fast the graphics are. And considering how much you guys use your Amigas for games, if you can't reliably play games on your fancy new $15 accelerator, what's the point? But remember, this is in beta, okay? But let's take a look at one of the best features of the PiStorm, which is its retargetable graphics. Follow me. So take a look at these beautiful retargetable graphics. This is in 1280 by 720 in full 32-bit color mode. It's going to give us 64 or 16 million colors on screen at once. And you're able to go into your screen mode and change your screen modes to other modes. I've got 640 by 480. I've got 800 by 600. Those are the ones that I created in anywhere from 8-bit to 24-bit color. And that works just great. Now, it will work with various programs, like we've got image effects on here. Let's see, work. We're going to launch image effects, and it'll ask us what screen we want to use. 1280 by 720, 32-bit color. Comes up just fine. I'm able to open up pictures, no problem at all. Here's a picture of the gal. Beautiful in full 24-bit color, and you're able to work with retargetable graphics. Not a problem at all. Now, this works in kind of an interesting way because this is all in beta. Basically, in a nutshell, you're going to load your Picasso 96. You're going to tell your Picasso 96 that you're using something like a Picasso 4 graphics card, okay? Then you've got a couple of files, which I'm listing down on the screen. It's PIG 020 or PIG 030. Once you install it, you're going to redirect board type. Instead of saying Picasso 4, you give it the name of the actual driver right there. PigFX 030. I thought that was funny. We're not done yet, because then, and you would normally be doing this from a standard RGB Windows screen, not an RTG screen, you would go into your Picasso 96 modes folder, or prefs. You have to bind a board to it, so you attach board, PiStorm, click this little button, drag it here to tell it you're using the PiStorm. Then you click this button, you drag it down here, it creates a new video mode. You highlight that mode, click the button again, drag it there, and you can then change like the colors of the video mode. You don't need to mess with any of these. These are fine. But you change your video modes. You do that for every mode you want. So like here, I drug it over and I said 1280 by 720, which you change right here. And I wanted it in 256 color, high color, true alpha. I did it for 640 by 480. I did it for 800 by 600. You just create these modes. And again, I will go over all of this in the tutorial. Once you do that, and then you reboot again, and you go into screen modes, and you're going to see your beautiful PiStorm RTG screen modes that you can change at a whim. And you can always go back to your standard RGB modes too without a problem. Now currently, just pick up a nice little switch box. I use a little 2-port HDMI switch box. I have one of them hooked up SCART RGB to my SCART to HDMI adapter, and then right into my switch box. And I have the PiStorm also connected right up to the switch box. So when I switch modes, I just press a little button, switches between them. There's talk of the guys making and pumping the RGB graphics straight through the Raspberry Pi, but I encourage them, make it more stable before you start adding more features. Now, most well-behaved programs can work in these RTG modes. So if you're using word processing, spreadsheets, things like that, you can use a program like New Mode or a program like Mode Pro, both of them free downloads from AmiNet, to tell these programs to instead open on a retargetable graphics screen, and they look flippin' fantastic. When they get networking on here, you can have eyebrows open right up on a retargetable graphics screen, and you can look at all your beautiful graphics on the web downloaded so slowly you can go crazy watching them, but they're going to be in full 24-bit color when they do download. Now, just getting retargetable graphics on your Amiga 500 or your Amiga 2000 for less than $100 investment, that right there is worth the price of admission. If you use it for productivity, that works pretty good. So with a nice emulated 68030 running 50-60 megahertz, the fast RAM, the fast drive, fast RTG graphics, programs like image effects here should just be blazingly fast, right? Well, sometimes, yes. When I load in a multi-megabyte JPEG file on here, it takes a lot longer than when I load the same file in on, say, my Amiga 1200 with my 040 accelerator using the built-in IDE on my Amiga 1200, which is only like 1.6 megabytes per second. You know, it just is slower, but that's okay, it still loads. When I do image processing, still loading. When I do image processing, scale the images using filters, it doesn't feel any faster than when I use my Terrible Fire 68030 at 40 megahertz. As a matter of fact, it feels slower by probably a good 30 or 40%. Is it faster than a 68,000 at 7 megahertz? Oh, heck yes. But when you're really pushing it, is it faster? Is it as fast as a 68030 at 50 megahertz? No, it's not. So what's going on here? Why would we run sysinfo and it says, oh, you're so fast, it's unbelievable, you're 68030. And yet when we run in the real world, we don't see that kind of performance? I have a theory. I think because this is an emulated CPU, when it has 100% exclusive access, like it does when you're running sysinfo, yeah, it'll process that. It'll say, hey, yeah, I'm super fast. When you get in the real world and you've got an Amiga that's saying, okay, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this moved to chip RAM, I need this processed, and it's trying to run a CPU and a floating point unit in a virtual space, I think it just chokes the Raspberry Pi. Now, could we overcome this with brute force by eventually using a Raspberry Pi 4? Probably. It would probably make it run like a real 68030 or real 68040. But still loading, by the way. This usually takes about 20 seconds on my other Amigas. I think the Pi 4 just gets bottlenecked the minute you try and push it in any way, shape, or form. And I don't think that the chip RAM helps at all. When you're running, if it's accessing chip RAM 33% slower than a 7 megahertz 68,000 chip, all right, it also is talking to the custom chips slower. It just has to be, because it has to all go through the same interface. So it maybe is talking to Agnes 33% slower, Denise 33% slower, and Paula 33% slower, slightly made up for by the fact that it's emulating a faster CPU, and it just drags the whole thing down. It's not as fast as you think. Now, our Amigas have been known since 1985 for their multitasking. Yeah, the original Amiga 1000, you throw in a 256K RAM expansion, you could multitask a couple of things at once back in the day, and they were fairly stable in the overall scheme of things. So obviously, the PiStorm, with what it can do, it's got to be a master at multitasking, right? No. Every single test I've done where I've done something like loaded image effects, still loading the JPEG image, and I've told it to maybe scale the image or do some processing on the image, I switch back over to Workbench. Workbench is still working fine. I'll load up Personal Paint. No problem at all. Load it up in RTG mode so it's not using any chip memory. Loads up okay. Start to bring in a picture. Maybe I can bring in a picture, but probably a good 60% of the time, as soon as I start multitasking more than one actual program, not a program and a Workbench screen, not a program and a calculator, okay, but 2 or maybe 3 actual programs in RGB mode, in RTG mode, it kills the PiStorm. Literally crashes the PiStorm, and then, oh look, it's finally loaded, amazing. And it crashes it right to Linux right on there. And you can't just reboot the Amiga. You got to power the whole PiStorm down, power it back up to get back up and running. So if your PiStorm is such a miracle device and yet can't multitask 2 real Amiga programs at a time, we've got problems. But remember, this is early beta and these things will improve, but you need to know before you go purchase one and put this in your only Amiga that you're going to have these kinds of issues. I know it sounds like I don't like the PiStorm. The truth is, I really like the PiStorm. I think it's an awesome bit of tech, and the guys have done a fantastic job. You know, here we are with an inexpensive accelerator. I'm running the Amiga RTG mode with 128 megs of RAM. That's some cool stuff. But right now, people in the Amiga community just pop onto Facebook that left and right, oh, PiStorm, greatest product of the year. PiStorm, it's going to save us all. PiStorm, better than the Vampire. No, you have to be honest. You have to understand this is an early beta, and it's going to have early beta issues. Like I mentioned a minute ago, if you've got one Amiga, an Amiga 500, and you're thinking, I'm going to get a PiStorm, this is going to solve all my problems, you're going to spend, like I did over the past 2 weeks, you're going to spend hours troubleshooting it, trying to tweak it, going, why is it acting like this? Is it something I'm doing wrong? Is there a configuration problem? Do I need to download and reload everything? And you spend hours just troubleshooting it, and then you realize it's just beta. It's just a little quirky, a little buggy. I'll be brutally honest. I've got a Terrible Fire 534. I got that one intentionally because I wanted the floating point unit. 4 megs of RAM. It performs better at everything than the PiStorm does. I plug that in, all my stuff works. I plug that in, I want to play a WHD load game, they all work. Fine, no problem at all, no argument, they just work. I want to use image effects, load an image in, process it, and then switch over and use personal paint and do something else. Okay, works. 125 bucks, done. With the PiStorm, I can't do that. I can do one thing at a time, and it runs reasonable if I do one thing at a time. I start multitasking, I start putting some challenges to the PiStorm, it dies. This will improve with time. The guys know about most of these issues, and I'm also filling them in on some of them, and I hope they watch this video and learn a few more. They're working on speeding up chip RAM access. That is going to be a huge help. If we could just get chip RAM access up to 99% of an Amiga 500, that's going to change things right there. That will probably make most of those games that I demoed feel like actual games again. It would not be impossible to bundle this with a Pi 3A and the PiStorm and a pre-configured SD card with everything you need on it. There would be some issues with licensing, like you'd have to somehow prove you own the license for Amiga OS 3.1 or 3.14 before a vendor would distribute it, you know, whatever. And it wouldn't be free. It's not going to be 15 bucks, people. There's a great community supporting the PiStorm on Discord. I spend a fair amount of time there. Great bunch of guys, more people every day. And they're willing to help. They're willing to talk about the issues you have, troubleshoot them. There's new updates coming out on just about a weekly basis. There's some instructions in the FAQ on the Discord about how to download updates to your PiStorm. I uploaded the latest ones 3 days ago. As far as I know, some of these problems might have been fixed by now. I'll go in, I'll do another update, maybe a couple little things are fixed. Most of these issues will probably get worked out, and then at that time, for $100, we will have a really cool acceleration option and RTG option for our Amigas. Huge thanks to my patrons who helped me out so much. Please enjoy this lovely image of a rose displayed in lovely RTG graphics on the PiStorm. And with my wonderful patrons' names scrolling on by. Now, if you'd like to appear on this esteemed list, just like my new patrons, Dane Archer, Retro Passion, and Sven Pook, pop on over to patreon.com/10mark for more information. Thanks a lot, everybody. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks for watching. I really do like the PiStorm project, but you just need to know the truth about it. And that's part of the reason you come to my channel is I don't whitewash things. I just don't. Please like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at 10mark1. I spend a lot of time there. But until next time, this is Doug from 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast signing out to go transfer a 10 gig HDF file back over to my PC so I can load some new stuff and test it.